The year was 1884, and the scorching heat of the Arizona Territory had turned the landscape into a furnace that tested the endurance of every living thing that dared to call this harsh land home. For Caleb "Cal" Hensley, a 38-year-old cowboy who had spent the last 5 years trying to scratch out a living on a small ranch in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, this particular summer had brought challenges that threatened to break not just his spirit, but his very will to survive. Cal Hensley had not always been alone. 3 years earlier, he had shared his modest spread with his younger brother Marcus, a spirited 26-year-old who had followed Cal west from their family farm in Missouri with dreams of building something grand in the untamed territories. The brothers had worked side by side, slowly building a herd of hardy cattle that could survive in the brutal climate, constructing corrals and water systems, and establishing relationships with the few neighbors scattered across the vast expanse of desert and mountain country. Marcus had been everything that Cal was not: optimistic where Cal was cautious, social where Cal preferred solitude, and blessed with an easy charm that made friends wherever he went. He had been the one who negotiated with suppliers in Tucson, who convinced skeptical bankers to extend credit, and who somehow managed to see opportunity where Cal saw only obstacles. Together, they had built the Flying H Ranch into a small but profitable operation that supported nearly 200 head of cattle and employed 3 seasonal hands during roundup time. But Marcus Hensley's life had ended on a rain-soaked morning in April 1881 when he had been thrown from a spooked horse and struck his head on a boulder. Cal had found him hours later, unconscious and bleeding, and had ridden 20 miles through mud and darkness to fetch the nearest doctor. But by the time they returned, Marcus was gone, his dreams and laughter silenced forever by a moment of tragic misfortune. The death of his brother had shattered something fundamental in Cal's spirit. Without Marcus's optimism and business acumen, the ranch began to falter. Cal found himself unable to make the connections and deals that had sustained their operation, and his natural tendency toward isolation became more pronounced as grief consumed his days and haunted his nights. He let the seasonal hands go, sold off portions of the herd to pay debts, and gradually retreated into a solitary existence that barely qualified as living. By the summer of 1884, Cal owned fewer than 50 head of cattle, most of them scattered across remote sections of his property, where they foraged for whatever sparse grass they could find. His ranch house, once a source of pride with its solid construction and careful maintenance, had fallen into disrepair. The roof leaked, the corrals needed mending, and the vegetable garden that Marcus had tended with such care had been reclaimed by desert scrub and tumbleweeds. Cal himself reflected the decline of his circumstances. Where once he had been a robust man, who took pride in his appearance and maintained his equipment with meticulous care, he now looked like a scarecrow left too long in the sun. His clothes were patched and faded, his beard had grown wild and unkempt, and his blue eyes had taken on the hollow, distant look of a man who had lost not just his brother, but his connection to the world of the living. The summer of 1884 brought a drought that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. For 3 months, not a drop of rain had fallen on the parched earth, and the few natural springs that usually sustained life in the region had dwindled to muddy seeps that barely provided enough water for basic survival. Cal's cattle had begun dying one by one, their carcasses scattered across the range like grim monuments to the desert's merciless power. Cal's own water situation had become desperate. His main well had run dry in July, and he was now dependent on a single unreliable spring located nearly 2 miles from his house in a rocky canyon that required a treacherous climb to reach. Each day, he made the dangerous journey with his horse and a pack mule, filling every container he could carry with the precious liquid that meant the difference between life and death. On this particular morning in late August, as Cal prepared for another water-gathering expedition, he was acutely aware that his situation had reached a critical point. He estimated that he had perhaps a week's worth of water remaining if he was extremely careful with his consumption, but the spring was showing signs of failing, and he had no backup plan if it dried up completely. The nearest reliable water source was the San Pedro River, more than 30 miles away across some of the most hostile terrain in the territory. As Cal loaded his pack mule with empty water barrels and canteens, he noticed something that made him pause. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, A thin column of smoke was rising from a grove of mesquite trees near the base of a rocky outcropping. Smoke in this country could mean many things, most of them dangerous. Bandits, hostile Indians, or desperate men who might kill for whatever supplies Cal carried. But as Cal studied the smoke through his field glasses, he noticed that it was thin and irregular, not the steady column that would indicate a proper campfire. It looked more like the feeble effort of someone who was either injured, inexperienced, or running desperately low on fuel. Against his better judgment, and driven by a curiosity that surprised him after years of avoiding human contact, Cal decided to investigate. The ride to the smoke took him across rough terrain that his horse navigated carefully, picking its way between boulders and around deep arroyos that could break a leg or trap an unwary rider. As he drew closer, Cal could make out what appeared to be a small, poorly constructed shelter made from dead mesquite branches and pieces of canvas. The smoke was coming from a tiny fire that seemed to be burning more dried grass than wood, suggesting that whoever had built it was either conserving fuel or had run out of proper firewood. When Cal was about 100 yards away, he called out in a voice that carried clearly in the still desert air, "Hello, the camp, I'm coming in peaceful." There was no immediate response, which made Cal even more cautious. He dismounted and approached on foot, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt .45, but not drawing the weapon. As he rounded a large boulder that had been blocking his view, he saw something that made him forget all thoughts of potential danger. Lying beside the dying fire was a man who appeared to be in the final stages of dehydration and exhaustion. He was an Apache warrior, probably in his 30s, with long black hair that was matted with sweat and dirt. His clothing consisted of traditional buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt that had once been white, but was now stained with blood and dust. Most telling of all, his lips were cracked and bleeding, his eyes were sunken deep into his skull, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Cal's first instinct was to back away and leave the dying man to his fate. Relations between white settlers and Apache bands in this region had been hostile for decades, marked by raids, reprisals, and a cycle of violence that had claimed hundreds of lives on both sides. This warrior might have participated in attacks on ranches like Cal's own, might have killed white families, might represent everything that Cal had been taught to fear and hate about the Apache people. But as Cal looked at the dying man, he saw something that transcended racial and cultural boundaries. He saw a fellow human being who was suffering in the same way that any man would suffer when faced with death by thirst in the merciless desert. The warrior's condition was so desperate that he posed no threat to anyone, and Cal found himself remembering Marcus's voice saying, "A man's worth isn't measured by what he looks like or where he comes from, but by what he does when he has a choice between helping and walking away." Cal knelt beside the Apache warrior and gently shook his shoulder. The man's eyes opened slowly, revealing a gaze that was cloudy with dehydration, but still intelligent and aware. He looked at Cal without surprise or fear, as if he had accepted that death was coming and no longer cared whether it arrived in the form of thirst, exposure, or a white man's bullet. "Water," the warrior whispered in English, his voice barely audible. "Please, water." Cal looked at his pack mule, where his own precious water supply was stored in carefully rationed containers. He had brought enough water for the journey to the spring and back, plus a small reserve for emergencies, but nothing to spare. If he shared his water with this dying Apache, he would be risking his own survival in a land where water was more valuable than gold. For a long moment, Cal wrestled with the decision. Every practical consideration argued against helping the warrior. Even if the man survived, he might return with his band to raid Cal's ranch. There was no guarantee that an act of mercy would be repaid with anything but violence. And Cal's own situation was precarious enough without taking on additional risks. But as he looked into the warrior's desperate eyes, Cal found himself thinking about Marcus and the values his brother had embodied. Marcus would not have hesitated to help a dying man, regardless of race or the potential consequences. Marcus had believed that showing mercy was not a sign of weakness, but a demonstration of strength, and that the measure of a man's character was revealed in how he treated those who were powerless to help themselves. Without saying a word, Cal went to his pack mule and retrieved his largest canteen, one that contained nearly a gallon of water that he had been saving for the return journey. He knelt beside the Apache warrior and carefully lifted the man's head, supporting him while he poured small amounts of water between his cracked lips. The effect was almost immediate. The warrior's eyes became more focused and his breathing grew stronger. After several minutes of patient care, he was able to sit up with Cal's assistance and drink more substantial amounts of water. Cal continued to share his precious supply until the canteen was nearly empty, keeping only enough for his own immediate needs. As the Apache warrior regained some of his strength, he began to speak in a mixture of English and what Cal assumed was Apache, though he couldn't understand most of what was being said. The man's voice was filled with gratitude, and he kept pointing to Cal and then to himself, as if trying to establish some kind of bond or understanding. "What's your name?" Cal asked, speaking slowly and clearly. "Nalnish," the warrior replied, touching his chest. "Nalnish, you save Nalnish?" "I'm Cal," he responded, following the same gesture. "Cal Hensley." Nalnish nodded gravely and then began speaking rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward the mountains and making what appeared to be urgent explanations. Cal couldn't understand the words, but the tone suggested that Nalnish was trying to convey important information about something. After several unsuccessful attempts at communication, Nalnish grew quiet and simply stared at Cal with an expression of profound gratitude. He reached into a small leather pouch that hung from his belt and withdrew something that he pressed into Cal's hand. It was a small piece of turquoise, roughly carved into the shape of a horse with intricate patterns etched into its surface. "Gift," Nalnish said in English. Nalnish, not forget. Cal accepted the carved turquoise, understanding that he was receiving something of great personal value. In Apache culture, such gifts carried deep meaning and represented bonds that extended far beyond the immediate moment. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Cal faced a difficult decision. He could not take Nalnish with him to his ranch, both because of the practical difficulties and because of the potential danger to both of them if other whites saw him harboring an Apache warrior. But he also could not leave the man alone in the desert with no water or supplies. After some consideration, Cal decided to guide Nalnish to a location where he might have a better chance of survival. About 5 miles to the north, there was a hidden spring that Cal had discovered years earlier during a hunting expedition with Marcus. The spring was located in a sheltered canyon that would provide protection from the elements and had enough water to sustain a person for weeks if necessary. The journey to the hidden spring took most of the remaining daylight, with Nalnish riding behind Cal on his horse and the pack mule following behind. Despite his recent brush with death, the Apache warrior proved to be a capable traveler who showed remarkable resilience and endurance. Along the way, he continued to speak in Apache, and Cal began to pick up a few words and phrases, creating a rudimentary form of communication between them. When they reached the hidden spring, Cal helped Nalnish establish a temporary camp in a sheltered spot where he would be protected from both the elements and potential discovery by hostile parties. Cal shared what food he could spare and filled several containers with water from the spring, ensuring that Nalnish would have adequate supplies for at least several days. As Cal prepared to leave, Nalnish spoke to him with great seriousness, using a mixture of English and gestures to convey his meaning. He pointed to Cal, then to himself, then toward the mountains where Cal assumed his people were located. The message seemed to be that Nalnish would not forget what Cal had done, and that this act of kindness would be remembered and honored. "You good man," Nalnish said, as Cal mounted his horse for the journey home. "Nalnish tell people. Cal Hensley, good man." The ride back to his ranch took Cal through the night, and he arrived just as the sun was rising over the eastern mountains. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and worried about the consequences of his decision to help the Apache warrior. He had used most of his water reserves and would need to make another dangerous trip to the spring within the next day or two. Moreover, he had potentially made himself a target for either Apache raiders who might not understand his motives, or white settlers who would view his assistance to an Apache as an act of betrayal. But despite these concerns, Cal found that he felt more at peace than he had since Marcus's death. For the first time in 3 years, he had acted according to the values that his brother had taught him, and he had chosen compassion over fear. Whether this decision would prove wise or foolish remained to be seen, But at least he had not allowed another human being to die when he had the power to prevent it. The next morning, Cal was awakened by sounds that sent ice through his veins, the thunder of hoofbeats, and the war cries of what sounded like a large group of Apache warriors approaching his ranch at full gallop. His first thought was that Nalnish had betrayed him, leading his people to attack the white man who had helped him. Cal grabbed his rifle and positioned himself at a window, prepared to sell his life as dearly as possible. But as the riders came into view, Cal realized that something unprecedented was happening. The Apache warriors were not attacking his ranch. They were surrounding it in what appeared to be a protective formation. There were hundreds of them, more Apache warriors than Cal had ever seen in one place, all mounted on fine horses and armed with rifles, bows, and traditional weapons. At the head of the group rode an elderly Apache man whose bearing and regalia marked him as a chief or leader of great importance. Beside him rode Nalnish, looking healthy and strong despite his recent ordeal. When the group reached Cal's front yard, they formed a large circle around his house, but made no aggressive moves. The elderly chief dismounted and approached Cal's porch, with Nalnish walking beside him as an interpreter. When they were close enough to speak without shouting, the chief began to address Cal in Apache, with Nalnish translating into English. "This is Cochise," Nalnish explained, though Cal recognized the name of the legendary Apache leader who had been making war against white settlers for decades. "He is my father. I told him what you did for me in the desert, how you shared your water when I was dying." Cal's hands tightened on his rifle, unsure whether he was about to be honored or executed. Cochise continued speaking, and Nalnish translated his words with obvious emotion. "My father says that you are the first white man who has shown kindness to Apache people without expecting something in return. He says that your heart is good, and that you have proven that not all white men are enemies of the Apache." Cochise stepped forward and began speaking directly to Cal, gesturing toward the warriors who surrounded the ranch. Nalnish continued to translate, his voice filled with reverence and gratitude. "My father says that you saved his son's life when you could have left him to die. He says that such an act creates a bond between families that cannot be broken. From this day forward, you are under the protection of our people." Cal lowered his rifle, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. Protection from Cochise's band meant that his ranch would be safe from Apache raids, a guarantee that was worth more than gold in this violent territory. But Cochise was not finished. He gestured toward several pack animals that had been brought with the war party, and Nalnish explained that they carried gifts for Cal: dried meat, hides, blankets, and other valuable goods. More importantly, Cochise had brought information about water sources that were unknown to white settlers, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death during the ongoing drought. "My father also brings you this," Nalnish said, as Cochise handed Cal a beautifully crafted rifle with silver inlays and intricate beadwork. "It belonged to his father and his father's father. It is a gift for a man of honor." As the formal ceremony continued, Cal learned more about what his simple act of kindness had accomplished. Word of his mercy toward Nalnish had spread throughout the Apache bands in the region, creating a ripple effect of goodwill that extended far beyond Cochise's immediate family. Several other chiefs had contributed warriors to the protection force, and agreements had been reached to ensure that Cal's property would be respected by all Apache groups in the area. The practical implications of this protection were enormous. Cal's cattle would be safe from Apache raids, he would have access to hidden water sources that could sustain his operation even during severe droughts, and he would be able to trade with Apache groups for goods that were difficult to obtain through conventional channels. But perhaps more importantly, Cal had been given something that money could not buy: the friendship and respect of people who had every reason to hate white settlers. His act of compassion had bridged a divide that had seemed impossible to cross, creating a relationship based on mutual honor and respect rather than fear and violence. Over the following months, the partnership between Cal and the Apache bands proved to be mutually beneficial. The Apache warriors helped him recover stolen cattle, provided information about the movements of hostile groups in the region, and shared their knowledge of the desert that enabled Cal to find new grazing areas and water sources. In return, Cal served as a liaison between the Apache and white authorities, helping to prevent misunderstandings that might have led to violence. The drought eventually broke, but the relationships that had been forged during that desperate time continued to flourish. Cal's ranch became a neutral meeting ground where Apache and white traders could conduct business safely, and his reputation as a fair and honest man spread throughout the territory. As word of Cal's story spread, he began receiving visitors from across the Southwest, military officers who wanted to understand how he had achieved peace with the Apache, merchants who hoped to establish trade relationships, and even journalists who came to document this unprecedented example of cooperation between traditional enemies. But Cal always insisted that the real credit belonged to Chief and Cochise, who had chosen to respond to a simple act of kindness with generosity that far exceeded anything Cal could have imagined. He kept the turquoise horse that Chief had given him in a place of honor on his mantelpiece, and he often told visitors that it represented the most valuable trade he had ever made, a canteen of water in exchange for a friendship that had transformed his life. 3 years after his encounter with Chief in the desert, Cal Hensley had rebuilt his ranch into one of the most successful operations in Arizona Territory. He employed both white and Apache workers, maintained peaceful relationships with all the local tribes, and had become one of the most respected men in the region. But he never forgot the lesson that Marcus had taught him, and that Chief had helped him rediscover, that true wealth comes not from what we accumulate, but from what we are willing to share with others. And on quiet evenings, when he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the Dragoon Mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Cal would often see Apache riders on the distant ridges, silently standing guard over the ranch of the white man who had proven that kindness and courage could overcome even the deepest divisions between peoples. The story of Cal Hensley and Chief became legend throughout the Southwest, passed down through generations of both Apache and white families as an example of how a single act of compassion could change the course of history. And though the frontier eventually gave way to civilization and the old conflicts were replaced by new challenges, the principle that Cal had demonstrated remained as relevant as ever, that in a world divided by fear and suspicion, the simple act of sharing water with a dying stranger could open doors to understanding that no amount of force or negotiation could ever achieve.